Hi, it's Michael and Anthony here presenting Small Business Banter. A healthy micro and small business sector means a successful economy and a more vibrant society. Small Business Banter is about helping regional business owners better prepare for the current challenges, but also for the next stage of business success. I'm Michael Kerr, founder of Kerr Capital, advisors to business owners. Each week, with Anthony Turner from the Small Business Mentoring Service, we'll interview a different small business expert or a fellow business owner and get them to share their best tips and insights for you, the listeners. Small Business Banter is brought to you from the studios of 104.7 Gippsland FM and is heard across Australia on the Community Radio Network. Thanks also to our supporters, Kerr Capital and the Small Business Mentoring Service. Welcome to another edition of Small Business Banter. Today we've got three very special guests, but firstly I want to introduce Anthony Turner, my co-host from the Small Business Mentoring Service. Good morning, Anthony.
Good morning, Michael, and good morning to Dana, Andrew and Frank who are joining us today.
So Dana Nebraskis is from the Outback Alliance. She runs the office. Joining is two of the committee members, Andrew Drysdale, who is a very active director across the Natural Resources Management area, based out of Toowoomba. Welcome, Andrew.
Yes, thank you, Michael.
And Frank Quinlan, who's the Federation Executive Director of the Royal Flying Doctor Service. Welcome, Frank.
Thanks, Michael, and hi to your listeners.
Fantastic to have you all in. What I might do is get Dana just to give us a minute or two on what the Outback Alliance is all about and how it ties in with our program.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. So the Outback Alliance has been around now for about 5-6 years, and it is a group of organisations, and I think that promote remote our outback issues, policy, etc. The key issue or the key difference, I think, for the Outback Alliance to other organisations is that it's cross-sectoral. So we've got people from many different walks of life, many different kinds of organisations. So, we do have at least one member who represents small business, but that is a smaller part of our membership at the moment. And the rest, as you can see, we've got rangelands, we've got health services through the Royal Flying Doctors, we've got Aboriginal services, so environmental services like Pew Trust. So as a group, what we've tried to do is identify what are the common things around the outback and how can we work together to try and improve conditions in the outback.
Yeah, so the overriding vision is for a thriving Outback Australia.
It certainly is, yes.
And it takes a few players.
It does take a few players, and as you know, from a business point of view, in outback communities, everybody relies on each other for that community to thrive and function. So without business, without health services, without farming, all of those other things, those communities can't survive, and therefore then they don't have education and they don't have a whole range of other things.
Yeah, it's a downward cycle. Can I ask just when you talk about the outback, where does the outback begin and end?
I'll chime in there. The outback covers approximately 6 million square kilometres, or 80% of Australia, or the rangelands, outback in interchangeable terms, depends where you put the line. It's 80% of Australia. I think we've got probably 7 or 8 at most federal MPs, which would have 80% of their electorate in rangelands. So 8 out of a lot isn't a big percentage, and that 80% of the area has around about 3% of the population, Michael. So that's the challenge that we largely face when we're trying to influence government to have policies that work for a very, very large area, but a very, very small percentage of people with a very, very small voting power.
I guess, Andrew, one of the other issues you might have is also the diversity of people in that very vast area as well. I know from trips that I've done up into the outback regions and Central Australia and stuff, it's it's a very interesting and very different sort of lifestyle or population that is in those more remote areas. What do you see as some of the major challenges, particularly from a business perspective, for people living in outback or remote Australia?
I suppose I once owned a hardware store in Charleville, so I've got first-hand experience of what it is to own a small business as well as having a property there. The challenge of any small business, but particularly in remote Australia, is one that you haven't got a big population to sell your product into. But there are challenges of accessing your products, of transport, cost of transport. That's hard. In particular, the challenge in regard to perishables. That's particularly hard to make sure that you're getting fresh tucker out there. I know in Queensland's case, our rail system was one that we largely relied on to get products to the regional communities and remote towns, and that rail system is all but vanished. So that's a big challenge. We around the Rangelands Alliance, we've turned our focus to four policy areas to start with, and one is around procurement and trying to get governments, particularly with government services, or government-funded jobs and projects and the like, but also very large corporate ones, to have procurement so that people in those local communities, those businesses in those local communities, have at least an equal chance, if not a better chance, of competing against those bigger providers that sit in the coastal parts of the country. So there's some of the challenges, Anthony, but then the diversity of the people that live out there, that's one of the fantastic things about being in the outback. There is diversity. You walk down the main street of any of our communities or Alice Springs and you see diversity across a whole gamut of age, of ethnic background, of First Nation people, and we by large live in a pretty we live in a pretty collaborative way, and it's pretty special. There's no doubt about it.
It certainly is. The policy areas that you cover, include the natural environment. It's a massive part of it. Economics. I think what were the other couple of
land-based livelihoods. So obviously the whole pastoral sector, and health. And Frank can talk about the health side because he's the one who's out there experiencing on a day-to-day basis the health realities, or he isn't personally, but his organisation of health. So they're our key areas.
Yeah. So, and this is why in the reading I did, there's the interconnectedness of all those is so critical. I guess we might take some of those things for granted outside of Outback Australia. So, Frank, do you want to just give us a little bit of perspective on your organisation, which is known to most, if not all, Australians, and the work you're doing?
Yeah, sure. The Royal Flying Doctor Service is sort of really a child of the Outback in many ways, not a visitor. So communities in remote parts of Australia, mining companies, Indigenous communities, others have supported the Flying Doctors for more than 90 years now. And our core service is really about ensuring that folks who are living a long way often from the tertiary hospitals and other places can get the care they need as and when they need it. We call it the mantle of safety, just ensuring that when someone gets sick or when someone has an accident, that there's a service poised and ready to go to pick them up. But we also know that folks living in Outback Australia experience poorer health than their city cousins, that people die earlier, they have more complex illnesses, they often don't get access to some of the basic sort of treatment services and preventative services that we take for granted in the cities. And so a big part of our service is also about ensuring that those primary health care services delivered by doctors and nurses and allied health professionals are actually taken out to those communities and people get access to some of that prevention and care at the earliest possible time.
Greg, with those health issues you're talking about in the remote areas, obviously accidents and things like that, I heard you say about the sort of shorter lifespan out there. Is that sort of because of the harshness? Is that because of nutrition type things, or is and the access to appropriate foods, or what's sort of some of the key issues behind that?
Look, it's a really complex challenge, and that I guess is partly why we're part of this Outback Alliance, because the sort of direct health things you can think about, if people aren't getting their preventative health checks as often as others, they might be living a long way. We've got plenty of folks who are living a lot further than an hour's drive from a local GP or a nurse clinic, so they're not going to be getting some of those regular checks as often as they could unless there's special arrangements in place to deliver them. Some of the issues that you talked about diet, sometimes about the harshness of the environment. We talk about social and emotional well-being, that you really have to take the whole package all at once. And there's plenty of positive aspects, as Andrew identified. Plenty of people really take on outback living as a lifestyle because they love that lifestyle and they love the community that's often part of living in the bush. But I guess the main message of the Outback Alliance is that if we're going to be asking folks to, farm our fibre and our food, or mine our minerals, do those things, or tend our traditional lands, then we really have to put in place some special measures just to make sure that folks are getting access to the care and services that they need to support them.
The theme of commercial infrastructure has come up a few times. What you're talking about, for a sustainable outback is a much broader definition of infrastructure, personal health and, well-being and all those things. Can we just slightly switch? I'm really interested in the work you're doing is laying the foundations to educate and to create awareness. Where do you see, we've come out of 2020 with it's been a challenging year, right around the world. Given the work you're doing and the feedback you're getting, where are you seeing opportunities for Outback Australia, for regional Australia in the next little while? Is it from, if we take away international tourism for a period of time, do you see domestic tourism as really creating some great opportunities and some energy and some hope about some of the businesses? Andrew?
I'll give you an example of opportunity and challenge. In September last year, I was out of Winton, which is about 1,200 kilometres northwest of Brisbane. And I ran into people there they had a son over in America, and they were doing an outback trip that they had planned for a long time but never had done, because they always used to go and visit their son in America, and they couldn't do that. And that town was absolutely buzzing with local tourism, and it was a great outcome, particularly for the local businesses there. But that night we went to the pub, and the poor old publican was just about down on his knees, because that pub, 1,200 kilometres from Brisbane, where I think there was 2 or 3 COVID travellers in quarantine, but no community-based thing. had to abide by the same rules as a pub in the middle of Brisbane. And that fellow had been dragged over the coals because he hadn't got his diners to sit down. You have to sit down. You can't stand around and drink. And I thought the absurdity of having a set of rules that were set up for a bar or something in the centre of Brisbane applying to a pub 1,200 kilometres away, and it was being enforced. So that's a great example of where the publican had benefited from COVID, and showcasing, but the absurdity of having a one policy for all applied across the broad spectrum of the country. So they're examples that we look at through the Outback Alliance, and particularly around COVID, where we're trying to get governments to realise that you just can't take a one policy brush, whether it's around COVID or whatever, and apply it across the whole country.
Yeah, it goes to the very heart of like that small business. That hotel is a centerpiece of the community, and it's puts that owner under enormous personal pressure to want to make a living, but also do the right thing. Just quickly on today's episode of Small Business Banter, we're talking with Dana and Frank and Andrew from the Outback Alliance. I think, Frank, were you about to chip in with something along that line?
Yeah, look, I was only going to say that that small businessman that Andrew identified, the publican, I don't know him, but I would be prepared to place a very large bet that he will also be raising funds for organisations like the Flying Doctors. So it's not just about building his business, which is important, but I think we need to recognise that a lot of these business people in these communities really are the foundation upon which a whole lot of community activity takes place. The Royal Flying Doctor Service receives something like $60 or $70 million worth of donations each year from folks who are literally building their own communities, and that. We feel that creates quite a responsibility on us to make sure we do the best we possibly can to deliver those services. But as Andrew said, it's also about how we think differently about those communities to make sure we're giving them what they need to do that work, because small business people are often the leaders in communities and are often gathering other community supporters around them. And that's important ultimately to health, but it's important to people's lifestyle and health in the broadest possible sense. As I said earlier, it's the whole package of social emotional well-being.
I think this question from me is probably more Andrew's question. I'm just wondering, Andrew, you're talking about the 80-20, sort of the 80% of land is in the a part of regional sort of or outback Australia. Our organisation, Small Business Banter, we tend to reach a lot of coastal type businesses. So we're part of that 20% of land, but probably 80% of the population. So my question is sort of around how do you think small businesses in this more popular areas can actually work together with regional businesses and or support regional businesses in new and different ways to actually help provide the support that's needed in those more remote areas?
Good question, Anthony. And actually, it's 97% of the population that are in that 20% area.
Yeah, I was being liberal with that.
You've done a bit of research, have you?
I suppose I'll come from an angle. I'll be interested in Dana and Frank to also chip in here. But probably the biggest area that I think those small business people is through their chambers of commerce and the like, to help their country brothers and sisters in small business to have access to government and influencing government. Those small businesses sitting in 3 or 4% of Australia, they're but a tiny whisper when they go to Canberra, and they need the collective might of the small businesses and the Chamber of Commerces that sit in our big regional areas and our capital cities to get right in behind them and support them around whatever particular issue. a good example, using our Whitten friend as an example, to go to government and lobby government and say, look, this is absurd that we've got a set of rules down here applying to small businesses in Brisbane, and they've got to apply to a small business which is 1,200 kilometres away. So I think in that policy arena is the area I think, Anthony, that they can really, really help out. I mean, it'd be lovely to think that a small business in Brisbane will choose not to compete to win a government contract based out at Roma or Charleville, but in reality, you know, they've got to run a business. They've got to make a profit. So I think that's probably stretching it a little too far.
So apart from the policy side of it, what about the more pragmatic things that, you know, small businesses or businesses in the more populated areas can potentially do? So, you know, are there things, you know, are there challenges that you're working on? You mentioned supply lines and different things like that. Are there things like that, practical things that can be done that, you know, our listeners might pick up and say, oh, here's an opportunity to maybe partner with and or work with businesses in the more remote areas to make life better for everybody?
Well, that would be one. To partner, to even to provide, you know, maybe some of their staff, their experienced staff, go out to equivalent small businesses of the same type in remote areas and spend some time there to help upskill their staff would be a great example of a collaborative approach. You know, a small business in Sydney adopting or building a brother-sister relationship with a small business at Broken Hill would be something that, you know, I'm sure the people out in the remote parts of small businesses would appreciate. But I'm open to ideas. You've just thrown up one there before, but that's a good question.
I think a partner organisation in this is a small business mentoring service, and they're all about supporting owners, and, you know, whether they be, you know, in Outback or in sort of more urban areas. So it is a shout out for, you know, for any of those owners out there listening to contact the small business mentoring service. Or, you know, we've had conversations throughout this series of programs on mental health, on seeking advice, because it is a lonely and challenging time for. It's always been lonely in small business at the top, but it's even, you know, more challenging. You know, Frank, you talked about the well-being of owners, and we did have an earlier episode which I'd encourage people to check out, where we had a spokesperson from Beyond Blue. It was, I'm sorry, yeah. So, but it went to the very heart of that, because, you know, we're trying to support them. So, you know, encouraging owners to reach out to somebody to, you know, talk about those things, and not to because, as you said, Frank, they support the Royal Flying Doctor Service. They support the local footy club, and you know, we see this thread. You know, if the small businesses aren't, you know, prosperous, and the owners aren't well, or dealing with the day-to-day challenges, you know, it kind of, their community can take a big hit.
Michael, I actually think that's one of the big learnings that we've had out of this whole COVID crisis, really on two fronts. My work before I came to the Flying Doctors, I worked for 8 years in mental health, and the Royal Flying Doctors actually deliver mental health services into communities where there may not be the same local services as we get in other places. I think one of the learnings from the COVID crisis is that all of our mental health issues are talked about much more. You know, the isolation of quarantines and lockups has affected people, the pressures that folks are under when their business is disrupted, because the community requires shutdowns and quarantines and so forth. I think that has led to a much more open discussion about mental health issues, and that can only be important. And as you rightly said, the sole traders and small business people who are often working, you know, long hours in pretty tough environments and facing big challenges, often can get, you know, particularly isolated, and that's not a good place for them to be. But the other thing that I think we're learning, going back to your original question, I think out of the COVID crisis is that there is just this sense, I hope, of interdependence. And I think that folks in the city are realising that, we're all linked together. The Outback's a long way away. But if there's going to be a COVID outbreak in a vulnerable community in the Outback, that's going to affect everyone. And I hope that part of what we're doing is rethinking some of those ideas you've mentioned about supply chains, about partner arrangements, about opening up the policy discussion to say, well, actually, how can we make sure that we all have this basic level of safety and security, that we recognise our dependence on each other, and that we encourage governments to do their bit, but also that we continue to do our own bit, whether it's businesses working directly together or folks rattling a tin to raise some funds for a remote Outback service or business. There are just plenty of opportunities, and I hope that the COVID crisis is just bringing some of those to the top of our discussion.
100%, Frank. And I think as people have more limited options, over the next little while, they're going to be travelling out there, and maybe that becomes a bit more visible. So, look, thanks so much for your time. We're at the end of our program. Dana and Frank and Andrew, we'll put the links to the Outback Alliance and the other organisations that you're a part of that into our show notes. Really appreciate your time and insights today on Small Business Banter. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you both.
So that's all for today's episode of Small Business Banter. Anthony and I continue to be inspired by bringing you small business experts and other small business owners and hearing their stories. For any of the links, resources or information we've talked about on the show today, or to contact Anthony or myself, please head over to smallbusinessbanter.com, or you can find us on both Facebook and Instagram. Anthony and I would love you to tune in at the same time next week for another episode of Small Business Banter.